I want to do a review of the tools that I used and some terminology that I expressed in making our cute little apron recently. There's just a few of the things. I also used my handy dandy sewing machine. Excuse the cord. And let's do a review. What did we learn? First thing I did is I picked a pattern. I just happen to have this pattern. I don't even know if they make this pattern anymore, but I had it, and I decided to make the little lap apron. The bib apron is the one, of course, that has the bib attached to it. And I like the idea of 3 different types of fabric. So I drew my inspiration from the fabric in order to create my apron. My inspiration was that this fabric looked like a basket, didn't it? It looks like a basket weave. I like that idea. Well, what goes in a basket? Flowers. You can put flowers in a basket. That would look nice. And then I saw this fabric with little bees all over it, and I thought, oh my goodness, what pollinates flowers? Bees. So, of course, I thought this would look well together. I also paid attention to the fact that this had the most color in it. So therefore, I wanted everything to coordinate with this fabric. It had the yellow and the white and the black for the bees. It also had the pinks that would go along with this fabric. So that was my inspiration. Next, I need supplies. Well, you need straight pins. I'm old school, I use straight pins. Some people use clips. Whatever works for you, you can use it in order to pin your fabrics together. And we need a scissors. Now this is just a straight edge. And I also use pinking shears. If you see, these have teeth. Let's put some teeth on there, and it cuts your fabric funny. Let me demonstrate how this cuts your fabric. See, it gives you little teeth on your fabric. And that is good to use on fabric that wants to unravel and fray. If you'll notice, it starts coming apart with the threads. So if you use it on fabric that wants to do that, this helps to stop that. This is a rotary cutter, and you use it on a particular mat like this. You lay your fabric down and then you cut along your fabric. There was some straight lines I needed to cut, so I use this as my ruler. I could lay that on top of my fabric, still see my fabric, but still be able to cut through and get a nice clean edge. This is just a see-through ruler that helped me considerably to make that cut. I also used some thread. This is not the particular color I use, but I use them. And of course a bobbin that I loaded with the same color that I was using. That goes inside my machine. You always, 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 always need a measuring tape. And this measuring tape is very flexible. It's to be used while you're sewing. All these things you can get at your local Joann's or whatever store where you buy your material at. Sometimes you just need a ruler. So, you know, there you go. I need these. You may not need them. What are they? The magnifying glasses. Because, you know what? Trying to find that little tiny hole to thread a needle is really hard. I guess that means I'm old, right? Officially old, but that helps me. You may not need that. Of course, I needed my pattern pieces that were cut out, and I laid down on my fabric. I also used a thread ripper, and that's exactly what it's used for, to rip out thread. Maybe you did a stitch that you didn't like, didn't come out right, well, you can just rip it out. Be careful you don't tear your fabric. This is a transferable little pencil that you can mark on your fabric, like when they, little indicators like that, you can just put a little mark on the fabric where it's at, and it will wash out. You want to make sure you've got the stuff that will wash out. And sometimes you just need a dull pencil, and that helps to poke out corners. Not necessarily sharp, but pointy, that can help you poke out little corners. So my first thing was, of course, I laid out my pattern pieces, I cut them out. You can transfer the markings if you need to on your fabric. I paid attention to the grain line. This runs parallel with the raw edge of your fabric. What's the raw edge? Well, it's just that, the raw edge, which how your fabric lines up on the very edge. You will get a particular width of fabric, and each side of that fabric is a raw edge. I paid attention to the fold lines. I also paid attention to how many of these I'm supposed to cut. This is a pocket, and it says to cut 2. And if you want to do a contrast, as what I did, a contrasting fabric as opposed to the blue floral fabric, you would cut like I did with the bees. And you notice I used my pinking shears to cut out my material pieces. Why? Because I was using cotton, and cotton has a tendency to come apart at times, start to fray at the edges. So there you go. I also use some particular stitches, and I wanted to show you a few of them. I permanently sewed my straight stitches, or meaning my sewing stitches, with just that, a sewing stitch. If you can see how close that is. On my machine, that's at 2.5 stitch length. It's not a 2.5 inch, it's just a 2.5 on my dial. That's like right in between. If you'll see this stitch length, you see how, maybe you can look at the holes, might be better to see. You see how this seems much longer than one of these stitch lengths? Can you see the difference in the length of our stitch? This is my regular stitch length, and this would be a basting stitch. It's much longer, and it's not meant to hold your apron together, or your dress, or your skirt, whatever you're sewing. This is just to help you along the way, and we eventually pull those out. We don't keep this stitch. I would use this basting stitch to gather. So over here are 2 lines of basting stitches. And as you noticed in my pattern, when I said I wanted to create some gathers in my skirt, I sewed 2 lines of basting stitches, maybe 1/4 inch apart, 1/8 of an inch, something like that, along where I wanted to gather. And then I took the top 2 tails, let's see if I can get this, separate it from the bottom. We don't need the bottom, we just need the top 2. Let's see if I can grab that. There you go. And when I wanted to create some gathers, I just held the top 2 and I just started working. I kind of wind it around. Started working. Make sure you don't grab the bottom with the top, because when you do that, it won't do anything. It'll just stay there, and you won't get your gathers. You have to make sure you just gather the tops. I'm not pulling this thread. I'm just holding it tight, and I'm slowly working my fabric using my thumb and the back of my finger just to gently pull the fabric. Be careful you don't, like I said, yank on this. I tighten up on it as it starts to gather. Just be really careful how you work it, because you can snap that thread and then you would have to start all over. But you see how that then causes your material to gather? This would not be your final stitch then. You would then take your small stitch, your 2.5, and stitch over, making sure you sew where this does not show. This would be on the back part of your fabric. You wouldn't want to see it. But you would sew maybe just right below that. And then once that has been sewn into place with your regular stitching, then you would proceed to start pulling all this thread out, which you can. This is what you would do. You would just kind of gather, and it's going to break. Rarely does it go the whole way. See how I broke that? That broke, right? No problem. I just go to the back side and find the tails for my basting stitch. Hopefully you can see this. Get that corrected for you. And start pulling from this side. Oh, this one I'm going to be able to pull all the way out. That's awesome. Okay, there's still more. Then you can go to the front side and keep pulling. Say you're getting to the part where you're like, oh man, it's just not pulling all the way out. See how I pulled that one basting stitch out? You won't see it anymore once you've sewn below that. But it did its work. It did its job. It held your gathering in place until you could stay stitch it, until you could stitch it with your regular stitch. Let's say you want to get the rest of this out, but you have no tails left. By the way, when you baste, make sure you leave tails, long tails, on this side of your fabric and on the other side of your fabric that you are sewing, because you're going to need to use that to pull. Well, if you're going to get to a point where you just can't get it, you can use your thread ripper and you could cut through it. It has a little sharp edge running through here that you can just pull, and that will help you work out your stitching too. And then, you know, might be able to get a little more of a tail and pull it. Anyway, you would rip all that out as you know, as needed, and you could pull the rest of your stitching out. You see this little sharp edge, it allows you to get under that stitch. Sometimes you've made a mistake with your regular stitching. Well, it does the same thing. You can get under it and you can pull it, and you can rip it out if you need to redo it. I also wanted to show you zigzag stitch. I didn't use a zigzag stitch at all on this project, but that's what a zigzag stitch is. Your needle, instead of just taking straight bites, it kind of goes across like this, taking this kind of a bite. And you would use that on like really stretchy fabric. If you notice, when you're using stretchy fabric and you were to use a straight stitch, your stitches would break as maybe you're walking or whatever you're doing. Maybe it's a skirt, bottom of a skirt. If you just did straight stitches on a stretchy fabric and started walking in it, they would start to break over time because it couldn't handle the stress of that stretching. But if you use a zigzag stitch, you see how it can really stretch. There's no threat of it breaking. It would hold up much longer. Plus, zigzag stitches are also used for decorative stitches and other applications. You'll notice in your instructions, sometimes it will tell you to either do a 1/2 inch seam allowance or a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sometimes it's 3/8, sometimes it's 5/8. How do you find that? What does that mean? Well, we're just going to use this little piece of yellow fabric as an example. Let's say we're going to sew these two pieces together. It's a double piece of fabric. And it says to use a 1/2 inch sewing seam allowance. How do we find that? If you look closely on your machine, here's my little needle that I sew with. I don't know if you can see it or not. close. There it is. And you see like these hash marks, if you will. That's actually it actually is divots in your sewing plate. These are given at certain intervals, and that usually indicates your seam allowances. When they say do a seam allowance, they want you to take from the tip of your needle to over wherever that measures to on these lines. So I'm just going to look and see this. I know the center of my needle is here, and if I come over 2 of these hash marks, I am going to get 1/2 inch. As you can see, the sewing needle goes right between the center of these 2 little skis. And they're even separated a little bit. Use this little gap as your center gap, and then measure out towards your seam allowance out here. And you'll get the proper seam allowance. If I use the plate, the side of my foot, that's a 1/4 inch from the needle to the side of the plate. That would be a 1/4 inch, and it keeps going up. Each hash mark goes up 1/8 inch intervals until you get up to this part of the plate, and that's an inch. Normally, the most you would do would be a 5/8 seam. So if my instructions say sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I would place the selvage edge of my fabric to this hash mark. Put your foot down on there. And then I know that the tip of my needle to this hash mark is 1/2 inch. And I would sew the whole seam that way. If it says to make it 1/4, well, I would put my raw edge of my material right along the foot. And that would be 1/4. And so on. You can measure 5/8, you can measure 1/2, whichever it tells you to do. You place that fabric on that hash mark or on the side of your presser foot, and you will get the right depth of your seam allowance. That's what they mean by seam allowance. I will demonstrate a 1/4 seam allowance. I've got the raw edge of my material lined up with the side of my presser foot. I'm just going to sew it. As long as I make sure that my material stays right along the side of this presser foot I'm using as my guide, I know I'm going to get a 1/4 inch seam. Let me turn it off a zigzag to do that. Okay, let's try that again without the zigzag. As long as if I need a 1/4 inch seam, I would line up the raw edge of my fabric with the edge of my presser foot, and I would sew, making sure I keep my fabric right parallel, right under this presser foot. That gives me my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let's say it's 1/2 inch. The second divot is 1/2 inch. So let's line the raw edge of our material up to that second divot. Keep that raw edge in line with that divot there. Okay, you can see our first seam allowance was 1/4 inch. The second seam allowance is 1/2 inch. And you would go on and on. You know, however wide you want your seam allowance, you would then move it over to where these marks are. Say you get something and the mark is not there. You're like, oh no, that doesn't quite line up. Well, this is what I do. Just take a piece of tape. Say for some reason, some weird reason, it lies right in between those lines. Whatever seam allowance they want. Just put a piece of tape down, masking tape, and you would then follow the masking tape as your guideline. You would line up your selvage edge with the masking tape, the edge of the masking tape, and let's sew that. So there you go. I used that as my guideline. When in doubt, measure. Measure from the center. This is easy because the foot, you can see there is a gap right in here between on this presser plate. I'll show you in a minute. And that's the center where your needle comes down. You could then measure out. So I would measure from where my needle comes down, right through the center of these two little skis, if you will. And I would measure out to whatever hash mark that I have. If that's not correct, this one came out to 3/4 of an inch. I would just place a piece of tape over that at the 3/4 inch mark, and I would sew. You don't normally get a 3/4 inch, but you get a 3/8, a 5/8, and so you do it accordingly. You understand what I'm saying? Those are seam allowances. Let's talk fabric. It's a Michael Miller fabric, and it's called Basket Squares. And this tells you, these little icons, if I can get up here where you can see, these little icons tells what colors are in the fabric. And we know it's a number 1 pink, and then we have a white. And those are the 2 colors that was used to make this fabric. If you needed to buy more of this fabric and you couldn't find it in your store, when you would go back to the store and say, hey, can you order more of that? If you could bring them in this right here, if it's in stock, they could get it for you, because that would give them all the information that they need. This also is our selvage edge. All right, that's the selvage edge. So when they say to line up your pattern on the selvage edge, or line up, when it says to find the grain line, because this is also your grain line, your selvage edge is your grain line. And when they tell you to find the grain line and pin your pattern to the grain line, remember this arrow here says grain line. They want this arrow to run parallel with your grain line. Well, I would line this up, and this is where you need your measuring tape, of course, and you would measure out from this edge. I start at the top here. This edge to this edge would be a measurement. Say it's 10 inches. For grins, we'll say it's 10 inches from this edge to this edge. Then I would also want, and I would pin that in place. I put a little pin there. Then I'd come down to this little bit, last bit of my arrow, and I'd measure it over again. I want that line, this line, the middle of your arrow, to be 10 inches from this edge too. And pin, I would then pin that. And then I would pin all around the pattern piece. Okay, the reason why we do that is if you try and eyeball it, let's say I'm just going to lay it down. I'm going to try my best to eyeball it. I don't know if you can see this or not, but we will try. I'm gonna eyeball this pattern piece. Oh, that looks pretty straight to me. Well, I don't know if you can see that or not. Once you cut it out, can you kind of see how this fabric is not laying nice? You've got the pink color kind of running up like this as opposed to going straight across and giving you a nice uniform look to your pocket. That's why you want to be very careful. Always line up the grain line, running that. So that's very important. You saw something else here. On this pattern piece, if you can see, it says center fold. Always when you see arrows like that, sometimes they'll say cut on fold or center fold. This means you are to fold your fabric evenly. Make sure it's even. Don't just fold it. Okay, I'm going to fold it. I'm going to lay my thing on there. No. That's not what we do. We always want to be even because we want our pattern, we want our material to come out even. We want the pattern in our material to come out even. So I'm going to try and make it as even as possible by eyeballing it. Don't eyeball it, measure it. But I'm not cutting this out. So of course I would lay my center fold right on that fold. You do not cut in this area at all. You're trying to make a longer piece of this pattern. But instead of laying it all out and trying to cut a long length, we just fold it and it's easier to cut out. Once we open it up, we've got a piece that's twice as long. Make sure you follow any directions on the pattern itself. It says fabric. I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to put this up here like this. Okay. If you look on this piece, it says fabric cut 1 on fold. It also says interfacing cut 1 on fold. The interfacing is that material that has a sticky back to it and you iron it on the back side of your fabric. Once you're done cutting it out, you would iron it on that piece and that becomes a stiffener, and you particularly put that around waistbands or collars, sometimes around armbands, but it's very important to follow that instructions. This also has a fold line, if you can see. It says to fold that. You don't fold that while you're cutting. You are going to end up folding this fabric. This piece, once you've cut the pattern out, you will find out that you're going to end up folding this on your other material. So don't worry about folding it yet. Depending on what size I made, it gave me the little dots, the little places that became it. It also gives you little places for different sizes. I made the 7/8 and 7/8 pattern for the apron. Don't forget to cut out, notch out your little dart pieces right here. Very important. When you lay it on your fabric and you're cutting out your fabric, you cut out that little notch too. These notches help you to line it up to another pattern piece when you're sewing. It's kind of like connecting the dots, if you will, or like helping you to put a puzzle together and make sure everything matches up. Those are very important. Okay, on your instructions, it'll tell you right side and wrong side of your fabric. Well, obviously, right side or right side up is, you know, they're pretty colors. The wrong side of your fabric, of course, is something that is on the back side. You wouldn't use that. You wouldn't put that out, right? This would be underneath. You wouldn't see it. This is the top side up, and this is called the right side of your fabric. See if I can help. Here's some more sewing information that your pattern gives you. So right here, you can see the right side. See how that looks? It looks like there's more detail to it. And then the wrong side, they give you less detail. Interfacing has little dots on it. And once you see interfacing, you'd understand why. You got lining. Lining is a different type of fabric. If you look inside a really nice coat, you see a shiny fabric on the inside. It's not the same as the coat itself. That's lining material. And then they have underlining also, which is a different type of fabric. Sometimes they'll tell you to trim the corners. And we did that, didn't we? We had to trim some corners. How about notching the, we're going to notch the outer curve. Sometimes they're going to have you just trim a little bit of the fabric. Sometimes they'll have you trim just a little bit of the fabric away, not all the way down to your seam line. You wouldn't want to do that. Once you've sewn it, you'd want to take just a little bit of the bulk out so that when you turned it over and pressed it, you could get this nice shape going here. You wouldn't get all like bumpy and have too much fabric on the inside. Be careful you don't over trim, don't over notch it. We have this is to clip inner curves. Well, that's obvious. This is an inner curve. This is an outer curve. This is curving out. This is curving in. Here it says to trim excess fabric. When you sew two pieces of fabric together, sometimes you just need to trim one of those pieces of fabric. If I could show. Okay. Let's pretend I have stitched all along here. And they're going to want me to, let me turn this around here. Okay. Let's just pretend I have stitched all along here, and I'm going to want to turn my fabric right side out. Remember, this is wrong side out. When you're stitching, you usually put the two right sides together and then you stitch your seams and then you press out. Sometimes it has you do it a little bit different way, but then here's would be your seam. That's what it would look like on the outside. Okay, but back over here, I have stitched these lines together and they say, okay, trim the excess. Sometimes the fabric is just too big of a seam allowance, so that when you turn it, it's going to look, it's just not going to lay nice. They would have you maybe just trim a little bit of this excess fabric off, leaving, of course, your sewing line. Don't get too close to it, maybe about halfway. Or sometimes they just have you take off maybe a little bit from the underseam or this side of the fabric so that this can lay over nicely. Here are some, in our glossary, we also have some terminology. We have an edge stitch. If you'll see, they give you the instructions, they give you the definition of that. Stitch close to finish edge or seam. You can see on my trim here, I stitched pretty close to the edge, didn't I? The inner edge. That's what they mean by that. Well, the raw edge is always, sometimes this is your raw edge. If you're sewing this way, this is a raw edge. Something that you would not want to see on the outside of your finished piece. That's a raw edge. This can be a raw edge. That's very important. When you start your project, I would like you to read through everything. The glossary, fabric cutting layouts. Read everything. Understand what it means. Understand what your instructions are trying to tell you. What is contrast? What is 45/60 inch fabric? What is fusible interfacing? familiarize yourself with all the important instructions that it's giving you. And then you follow each instruction step by step. So I hope you go and you find a really simple project to do for your first time, especially because it can be frustrating if you try too hard of a project. You don't have to do an apron. An apron's easy. I happen to do the overskirt. If you want to try an apron and make it easier on yourself, just do the waistband, the ties, and the bottom portion of this apron. Don't put the extra piece on top. That's a really easy thing. You can find some really, really easy patterns in the store. If you're uncertain whether it's easy or not, ask one of the ladies in the store because they sew too and they can always help you. Just make sure you have all your notions. Notions meaning what do we need to finish the project, the right type of, if you need buttons or zippers or rickrack or a ruffled trim, you want to make sure you get that at that time, and you want to get the right thread and your sewing needles, of course, and your pins to pin it together. And then on the back of your pattern again, it will tell you what's the best type of fabric to use for this project. So hopefully you learned a few things through this course, and we'll see you next time. Bye.